The gunshot that echoed across Blackwater Plantation on that humid Georgia morning in June 1859 wasn't fired during a slave rebellion or by patrollers hunting escapees. It was fired by an enslaved man named Elijah into the chest of his master, Cornelius Blackwood, while the plantation owner sat alone in his study reviewing accounts, a murder so carefully planned and flawlessly executed that within 3 years Elijah would not only be a free man, but would own the very plantation where he had once been property, having seduced and married Blackwood's grieving widow before systematically taking control of everything that had belonged to the man he killed. The transformation from enslaved field hand to plantation owner represented the most audacious con game in American history, as Elijah used a combination of intelligence, charisma, and absolutely ruthless determination to accomplish what should have been impossible under any circumstances, elevating himself from the bottom of society's hierarchy to its pinnacle through murder disguised as accident, seduction disguised as comfort, and theft disguised as marriage settlement. If you're ready to discover the most incredible rags-to-riches story ever told, where a brilliant enslaved man used murder, manipulation, and seduction to go from picking cotton to owning the plantation, from being property to possessing property, and from facing the whip to wielding absolute power over the same Georgia county that had once held him in bondage, hit that subscribe button right now. Give this video a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Elijah accomplished through 5 years of patient planning, perfect acting, and the kind of strategic thinking that white society claimed black people couldn't possess will challenge everything you thought you knew about intelligence, ambition, and the lengths that extraordinary individuals will go to transform impossible circumstances into ultimate victory. The man who would become known throughout Georgia as the most successful con artist in American history had been born into slavery at Blackwater Plantation in 1829, the son of an enslaved woman named Sarah and an unknown white father whose identity Elijah never learned, but whose genetic contribution had given him the light complexion and sharp features that would eventually help him pass as a free man of mixed race rather than an escaped slave. From his earliest memories, Elijah had possessed an intelligence and ambition that set him apart from other enslaved children. He had taught himself to read using scraps of newspapers and books discarded by the Blackwood family, had learned to imitate various accents and speech patterns by listening to visitors from different regions, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to understand people's desires and weaknesses and to present himself as exactly what they needed him to be. The year was 1859, and Georgia stood on the brink of the sectional crisis that would lead to civil war. But the state's plantation society had reached the apex of its wealth and confidence, built upon cotton cultivation that generated enormous fortunes for those who owned land and enslaved labor. Blackwater Plantation sprawled across 8,000 acres of prime cotton land in central Georgia's richest agricultural region, its boundaries encompassing not just fields but also timber stands, river frontage, and the small town of Millbrook, where Cornelius Blackwood owned the general store, the cotton gin, and most of the businesses that served the surrounding agricultural community. The plantation represented the kind of economic empire that successful planters built during cotton's golden age: diversified, profitable, and seemingly permanent. Master Cornelius Blackwood, 48 years old in 1859, embodied the contradictions of Georgia's planter aristocracy, a man who claimed Christian piety while owning 300 human beings, who spoke eloquently about honor and civilization while enriching himself through a system built on systematic violence and exploitation. Blackwood had inherited Blackwater from his father, but had expanded it through shrewd land purchases and aggressive cotton cultivation that required brutal work schedules for the enslaved people whose labor produced his wealth. He was known throughout central Georgia as a successful businessman and a pillar of his community, serving as deacon in the local Baptist church and hosting political gatherings where Georgia's elite planned their resistance to Northern abolition efforts. But Blackwood's greatest vulnerability, and the weakness that Elijah would exploit to destroy him, was his marriage to Margaret, a beautiful but emotionally fragile woman, 20 years his junior, who had been raised in Savannah society and who had never adjusted to the isolation and responsibilities of plantation life. Margaret Blackwood was 38 years old in 1859, childless after 15 years of marriage, and increasingly dependent on laudanum to cope with what she described as nervous disorders, but which were actually profound depression caused by the emptiness of her privileged but purposeless existence. She spent most days in her room reading romance novels and consuming the opium-based medication that was freely available and widely used by Southern white women who had been taught that their only purpose was ornamental, but who discovered that ornamental lives were psychological torture for intelligent women with no outlet for their capabilities. Elijah's position at Blackwater, as Cornelius's personal manservant, had given him unprecedented access to the Blackwood family's private life, allowing him to observe the master's business dealings, the mistress's emotional vulnerabilities, and the dynamics between husband and wife that revealed exploitable weaknesses in what appeared from outside to be a successful and stable marriage. As Cornelius's valet and trusted assistant, Elijah accompanied his master on business trips, was present during important meetings with other planters and merchants, and gradually gained the kind of comprehensive understanding of Blackwater's operations that would be essential when the time came to take control of the plantation. The relationship between Elijah and Margaret had been developing for 3 years by 1859, beginning as the kind of inappropriate intimacy that sometimes occurred between enslaved men and lonely plantation mistresses, but evolving into something far more dangerous for everyone involved. Margaret had initially been drawn to Elijah's intelligence and refinement, qualities that made him more interesting company than her husband, who cared only for business and politics, but over time, her interest had become romantic and then sexual, creating a relationship that violated every taboo of Southern society while providing both participants with emotional and physical satisfaction they couldn't find elsewhere. The affair between Margaret and Elijah was conducted with extreme secrecy and sophistication that revealed both the mistress's desperate need for connection and the enslaved man's understanding that such relationships could be weaponized if managed correctly. They met in secluded parts of the plantation house when Cornelius was away on business, communicated through coded messages left in books and household items, and developed an emotional intimacy that was far more dangerous than simple sexual exploitation because it involved genuine affection that made Margaret willing to consider actions she would never have contemplated for mere lust. The transformation of their affair from secret romance into conspiracy for murder had occurred gradually during 1858, as Elijah began suggesting that Margaret deserved better than her current life, that Cornelius didn't appreciate her intelligence and beauty, and that circumstances might someday allow them to be together openly, if fate removed the obstacles that kept them apart. Elijah's manipulation was so subtle that Margaret never realized she was being recruited for murder. She believed that she had independently reached the conclusion that her husband's death would liberate her from an unbearable marriage and allow her to find happiness with the only man who had ever truly understood and appreciated her. The planning of Cornelius Blackwood's murder had involved solving several complex problems, including how to kill him in a way that wouldn't be investigated as homicide, how to ensure that Margaret would inherit the plantation rather than distant relatives, and how to position Elijah to benefit from Cornelius's death without arousing suspicion that an enslaved man had been involved in his master's demise. The solution that Elijah developed was elegant in its simplicity. Cornelius would die in a hunting accident that Elijah would witness and report. Margaret would be so distraught that she would need constant support from her late husband's most trusted servant, and their subsequent romantic relationship would be viewed as a grieving widow finding comfort with the only man available, rather than as the culmination of an affair that had motivated murder. The specific circumstances of the murder required careful attention to timing, witnesses, and physical evidence that would support the hunting accident narrative, while concealing the fact that Cornelius had been deliberately shot by someone he trusted completely. Elijah had spent months studying his master's habits, identifying opportunities when they would be alone and isolated, and preparing the scene for a killing that would appear accidental to anyone who investigated. The hunting accident scenario was perfect because it was common, because it would occur in isolated areas where witnesses were unlikely, and because Elijah's presence as Cornelius's hunting companion would be expected and unremarkable. But the murder was only the first phase of Elijah's plan to acquire Blackwater Plantation through a combination of psychological manipulation and legal maneuvering that exploited both Margaret's emotional vulnerability and Georgia's laws about property inheritance. The second phase involved consolidating his influence over Margaret during her grief, gradually transitioning from comforter to romantic partner, and eventually convincing her that marriage to him was not only possible but desirable, despite the racial and social barriers that made such unions illegal and scandalous in 1850s Georgia. The legal obstacles to Elijah's ultimate plan were substantial, as Georgia law prohibited marriages between whites and blacks, regardless of the specific racial backgrounds involved. And as an enslaved person, Elijah couldn't legally own property or enter into contracts even if marriage were possible. But Elijah had identified loopholes and workarounds that could be exploited by someone with detailed knowledge of how Georgia's legal system actually functioned, rather than how it was supposed to work in theory, understanding that laws could often be circumvented by people with sufficient money, influence, and willingness to exploit the corruption and incompetence that characterized local government. The third phase of his plan involved using Margaret's legal ownership of Blackwater to gradually transfer actual control to himself while maintaining the fiction that he remained her servant rather than her partner, creating a situation where he would wield real power over the plantation's operations, while she retained nominal ownership that protected both of them from legal challenges. This phase would require the most delicate maneuvering because it involved convincing Margaret to make decisions that benefited Elijah while maintaining his apparent subservience, and because it required managing the enslaved population's knowledge that their former peer had somehow achieved extraordinary elevation without creating rebellion or exposure that would destroy the entire scheme. The morning of June 15, 1859, dawned clear and hot as Elijah prepared to execute the murder that would begin his transformation from enslaved property to plantation owner, checking his rifle one final time while mentally rehearsing the performance that would convince everyone that Cornelius Blackwood had died in a tragic hunting accident rather than being deliberately killed by the man he trusted most in the world. The irony that Cornelius would be murdered using a gun he had given Elijah for hunting, trusting an enslaved man with a loaded weapon because he considered that particular enslaved man completely loyal and reliable, was not lost on the man who was about to prove that trust could be weaponized by people with sufficient intelligence and determination to exploit it. The intelligence that would enable Elijah to accomplish what should have been impossible, ascending from enslaved field hand to plantation owner through murder and manipulation, had manifested from his earliest childhood as an almost supernatural ability to learn, remember, and understand systems with minimal exposure or instruction. By age 6, Elijah had taught himself to read by memorizing the shapes of letters in newspapers used to wrap goods from the Blackwood store, had learned basic arithmetic by watching transactions and calculating prices in his head, and had begun studying human behavior with the kind of systematic attention that most people never develop even in adulthood. His mother Sarah had recognized that her son possessed extraordinary capabilities and had done everything possible to protect and nurture his intelligence while preventing white authorities from recognizing that an enslaved child had intellectual gifts that challenged every assumption Georgia society held about racial differences and black people's supposed mental limitations. The foundation of Elijah's education had been built through observation and theft rather than formal instruction, as he learned to exploit every opportunity to access knowledge that was supposedly forbidden to enslaved people. He stole books from the Blackwood Library and read them by candlelight after exhausting fieldwork, memorized conversations he overheard between white people discussing business and politics, studied the behavior of successful planters and merchants to understand what made them effective, and gradually accumulated comprehensive knowledge about law, commerce, agriculture, and human psychology that would prove essential when the time came to execute his audacious plan to murder his master and steal his property. But knowledge alone wouldn't have been sufficient for Elijah to accomplish his ultimate goal. He also needed to develop the psychological skills that would allow him to manipulate people into serving his interests while believing they were acting according to their own desires. The manipulation techniques that Elijah mastered during his teenage years and perfected during his 20s involved understanding what people wanted most desperately, presenting himself as capable of providing those things, creating emotional dependencies that could be exploited, and maintaining multiple simultaneous performances that showed different faces to different audiences depending on what each person needed to see. The specific circumstances that had elevated Elijah from field hand to Cornelius Blackwood's personal manservant had occurred in 1854 when the previous valet had been sold away, and Cornelius needed a replacement who was intelligent, reliable, and refined enough to accompany him on business trips without embarrassing him in front of other plantation owners. Elijah had recognized this as the opportunity he had been preparing for, and had orchestrated a performance of competence and loyalty that convinced Cornelius that this particular enslaved man was exceptional enough to be trusted with responsibilities usually reserved for white servants. The transformation from field labor to household service had been the first major step in Elijah's long-term plan, providing access to the Blackwood family's private life and creating opportunities for the intimate knowledge and manipulation that would make murder and theft possible. The 5 years that Elijah spent as Cornelius's valet had been marked by patient accumulation of trust, information, and influence that would eventually allow him to destroy and replace his master. Elijah learned every detail of Blackwater's operations, including which properties were most valuable, which debts were outstanding, which contracts were profitable, and which legal vulnerabilities existed in Cornelius's business empire. He studied Margaret's psychology and identified the loneliness, frustration, and desperate need for emotional connection that would make her vulnerable to manipulation. Most importantly, he positioned himself as absolutely indispensable to Cornelius, becoming the trusted advisor and companion whose presence was so routine and expected that no one would question his being alone with the master in situations where murder could occur. The development of the affair between Elijah and Margaret, that would become the foundation for his ultimate takeover of Blackwater, had begun in 1856 with conversations that seemed innocent but which Elijah carefully designed to establish emotional intimacy. Margaret had been reading a romantic novel one afternoon when Elijah brought her tea, and he had commented on the book, with insights that revealed he had read it himself and understood its themes with depth that surprised and intrigued her. The conversation that followed, about literature, about feelings, about the gap between romantic ideals and disappointing reality, had been the first crack in the walls that separated enslaved servant from lonely mistress. The progression from intellectual conversation to emotional intimacy to physical affair had taken 18 months of careful escalation as Elijah moved Margaret through stages that felt natural to her, but which were actually being orchestrated with precision by someone who understood exactly what he was doing and why. Each conversation revealed slightly more about Margaret's unhappiness, her unfulfilled desires, her growing conviction that Cornelius didn't appreciate or understand her. Each meeting became slightly more physically intimate, a hand touch that lingered, a moment of eye contact that communicated more than words, eventually stolen kisses, and then full sexual encounters that violated every taboo of Southern society, but which Margaret experienced as liberation rather than degradation. But Elijah's ultimate goal was never simple sexual gratification or even genuine romantic connection. It was acquisition of power and property that required Margaret's complete emotional dependence and her willingness to act against her own husband's interests when the time came. The psychological manipulation that Elijah deployed to achieve this went far beyond seduction into systematic creation of a reality where Margaret came to believe that Elijah was the only person who truly understood and valued her, that Cornelius was an obstacle to her happiness rather than her rightful husband, and that circumstances might someday allow her to be with Elijah openly if only fate would remove the impediments to their love. The specific moments when Elijah planted the seeds of murder in Margaret's mind were so subtle that she never recognized she was being recruited for conspiracy rather than arriving at conclusions independently. A comment about how much happier she would be if Cornelius weren't constantly demanding her attention for social obligations she hated. A discussion about widows who had found new happiness after their husbands' deaths from natural causes. A carefully casual mention that hunting accidents were tragically common among Georgia planters who took unnecessary risks. Each seed was planted months apart, given time to germinate in Margaret's laudanum-affected consciousness, until the idea that Cornelius's death would solve all her problems seemed to have emerged organically from her own thinking, rather than having been deliberately cultivated by her lover. The planning of Cornelius's murder during the spring of 1859 had involved Elijah working through multiple scenarios and selecting the one that provided maximum likelihood of success with minimum risk of detection. The hunting accident scenario was optimal because it was common enough to be believable, because it would occur in isolated locations where the only witness would be Elijah himself, and because it would allow Elijah to control the narrative about what had happened without contradictory evidence. The key was ensuring that the wound pattern would be consistent with an accidental discharge rather than deliberate shooting, that Elijah's emotional response would appear appropriately shocked and grief-stricken rather than relieved or satisfied, and that Margaret's subsequent behavior would support the accident narrative rather than raising suspicions about her involvement. The psychological preparation that Elijah conducted during the weeks before the murder involved ensuring that Margaret understood what was about to happen without ever being told explicitly, creating plausible deniability that would protect both of them if investigations became too probing. Elijah had mentioned during their final meeting before the planned hunting trip that he hoped nothing bad would happen, that accidents were always possible when people carried loaded guns, and that he wanted Margaret to know that, whatever happened, he would always protect her interests and ensure her well-being. The language was ambiguous enough that Margaret could later claim she had thought he was expressing general concern rather than signaling that murder was imminent, but clear enough that she understood what was coming and approved by not stopping it. The morning of June 15th had seen Elijah and Cornelius departing for hunting in the forest sections of Blackwater, where deer were plentiful and where isolation would ensure that the murder could occur without witnesses. Cornelius had been in good spirits, pleased with recent cotton prices, and optimistic about the coming harvest, discussing plans for expanding his property holdings and perhaps purchasing additional enslaved workers to increase production. The irony that Cornelius was planning to expand an empire he would never live to enjoy, discussing it with the man who would kill him within hours and eventually possess everything he had built, created a satisfaction in Elijah that he carefully concealed behind the mask of loyal servant that he had been perfecting for 5 years. The psychology of murder, the transformation from planning to actual killing, involved Elijah overcoming natural human reluctance to take another life while maintaining absolute control over his emotional state and physical actions to ensure that the execution would be perfect. Elijah had never killed anyone before and understood that even the most carefully planned murder could fail if the killer's nerve broke at the critical moment. He had spent weeks mentally rehearsing the act, visualizing the trigger pull and the bullet's impact, preparing himself psychologically for the sight of his master dying from a wound he had deliberately inflicted, and reinforcing his conviction that this murder was not a crime but a liberation that would free not just himself, but also Margaret from an oppressor who deserved death for the systematic violence he had deployed against enslaved people for decades. The actual murder occurred approximately 3 miles into the forest when Cornelius had stopped to examine deer tracks and was crouching with his back to Elijah, presenting a perfect target that eliminated the possibility of Cornelius seeing the deliberate aim that would precede his death. Elijah had raised his rifle slowly, sighting carefully on the center of Cornelius's back, where the bullet would penetrate the heart and ensure immediate death without the possibility of the wounded man surviving, long enough to reveal that his shooting had been deliberate rather than accidental. The trigger pull had been smooth and controlled, the recoil familiar from practice, the bullet's flight time less than a second before it struck exactly where Elijah had aimed and dropped Cornelius Blackwood face first into Georgia dirt where he belonged. The performance that Elijah delivered in the seconds and minutes after murdering his master represented the culmination of years of acting practice. As he forced his voice to shake with appropriate shock and horror, ran to Cornelius's body and attempted futile resuscitation efforts that would demonstrate proper concern, and eventually ran back toward the plantation house, screaming for help in a way that would establish the narrative of tragic accident rather than deliberate murder. The tears that streamed down Elijah's face as he burst into the house shouting that the master had been shot were real, but they were tears of relief and vindication rather than grief. Relief that the murder had succeeded without complications, and vindication that his 5-year plan to destroy and replace Cornelius Blackwood was proceeding exactly as designed. The immediate aftermath of the shooting saw Elijah maintaining perfect performance as the devoted servant destroyed by his master's death, sobbing through his account of how the rifle had accidentally discharged when Cornelius stumbled over a root, how he had tried desperately to save the master but the wound was too severe, how he couldn't believe this tragedy had occurred and kept wishing he could undo what had happened. The performance was so convincing that no one, not the doctor who examined Cornelius's body, not the sheriff who investigated the death, not even Margaret who knew the truth, ever expressed suspicion that the shooting had been anything other than the tragic accident that Elijah described. But while Elijah maintained his public performance of grief-stricken loyalty, he began immediately to execute the second phase of his plan, consolidating his influence over Margaret during her genuine grief and gradually transitioning from comforter to romantic partner to eventual husband who would control everything that had belonged to Cornelius Blackwood. The genius of Elijah's approach involved understanding that Margaret's grief was real, even though she had consented to, or at least not prevented, her husband's murder, and that her emotional vulnerability during mourning would make her more dependent than ever on the only person who truly understood her and who could provide the comfort and support that would help her survive the terrible loneliness that widowhood would bring. If this incredible story of murder, manipulation, and audacious ambition has you completely gripped and desperate to know how Elijah transformed from his master's murderer into his widow's lover and eventually into the owner of everything that once enslaved him, make sure you hit that like button right now to support these extraordinary tales of intelligence weaponized against impossible odds. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss these deep dives into the most shocking true stories where enslaved people used every tool available, including murder, to liberate themselves and acquire the power and property their oppressors claimed they could never possess. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you think about Elijah's methods. Was he a genius who deserved to succeed, or a murderer who should have been punished? I read every comment and love hearing your perspectives on these complex moral situations. The stage was set for the second and third phases of Elijah's plan, seducing Margaret openly now that Cornelius was dead, convincing her to make decisions that would gradually transfer control of Blackwater to him, and ultimately finding a way to legally possess the plantation that he had stolen through murder and manipulation rather than through any lawful inheritance or purchase. The seduction of Margaret Blackwood during the months following her husband's murder represented the most delicate phase of Elijah's plan, as he needed to transition from secret lover to open companion, without arousing suspicions that their relationship had existed before Cornelius's death, or that it had motivated the murder they both knew was deliberate rather than accidental. The transformation began subtly during the funeral arrangements, as Elijah positioned himself as Margaret's primary support, the devoted servant who understood her grief better than anyone else, and who could provide the practical assistance and emotional comfort that Southern widowhood required. But within weeks, the nature of their relationship shifted from servant-mistress to something that Georgia society couldn't quite define or accept: a wealthy white widow, increasingly dependent on an enslaved man who possessed intelligence, education, and refinement that challenged every assumption about racial hierarchies, while creating a scandal that would eventually force Margaret to choose between social acceptance and the only person who had ever truly understood her. The initial weeks of Margaret's widowhood had been consumed with funeral arrangements, legal proceedings to settle Cornelius's estate, and the performance of grief that Southern society expected from respectable widows, regardless of their actual feelings about their dead husbands. Elijah had been indispensable during this period, managing household operations that Margaret couldn't focus on, dealing with lawyers and business associates who came to discuss estate matters, and providing the kind of comprehensive support that made him seem less like a servant and more like a partner who shared responsibility for navigating the crisis that Cornelius's death had created. But underneath the public performance of devoted servant supporting his bereaved mistress, Elijah had been systematically consolidating his control over Blackwater's operations in ways that would make him indispensable, not just emotionally, but also practically. He had inserted himself into conversations with the plantation's overseer about planting decisions, had taken over management of accounts and records that Cornelius had previously controlled, and had begun making decisions that technically required Margaret's approval, but which she rubber-stamped because she trusted Elijah completely and because she lacked the knowledge or interest to manage agricultural and business operations herself. The progression from hidden lover to open companion had occurred gradually during the summer and fall of 1859, as Margaret's grief faded and her dependence on Elijah deepened into a relationship that Georgia society found increasingly scandalous. The first signs of impropriety that neighbors noticed involved Elijah spending time in the main house during evening hours, when servants should have been in their quarters, taking meals with Margaret in the dining room rather than eating separately as hierarchy demanded, and generally behaving with a familiarity and equality that violated every convention about how enslaved people should relate to their owners. The scandal that began circulating through Central Georgia's Plantation Society during the fall of 1859 created enormous pressure on Margaret to dismiss Elijah, or at least to restore proper distance between mistress and slave, as neighboring plantation owners and their wives made increasingly pointed comments about the inappropriate relationship that seemed to be developing at Blackwater. The criticism reached crescendo when the pastor of Margaret's church visited to express concern about rumors that she was allowing an enslaved man to exercise authority over plantation operations and possibly over her person in ways that violated not just social convention, but Georgia law prohibiting interracial relationships. The confrontation between Margaret and the church delegation that came to demand she restore proper racial hierarchy represented a crisis point where Elijah's hold over her was tested against the combined pressure of family, community, and the social networks that had sustained her identity as respectable Southern lady. The meeting occurred in Blackwater's parlor on a Sunday afternoon in November 1859, with Margaret's sister, the pastor, and two prominent plantation owners presenting a united front, demanding that she either sell Elijah away immediately or face social ostracism and potential legal consequences for conducting an interracial relationship that everyone could see was developing regardless of whether it had yet become sexual in nature that witnesses could testify to. Margaret, you must understand that what you're doing is destroying your reputation and dishonoring Cornelius's memory, her sister began, attempting an approach that combined family concern with appeal to propriety. This slave, Elijah, is behaving as if he were your equal or even your master rather than your property. People are talking. They're saying things about your relationship that are destroying your standing in society. You need to sell him away immediately and restore proper order to your household before the damage becomes permanent. Margaret's response revealed how completely Elijah had succeeded in making her dependent on him and willing to sacrifice social acceptance rather than lose the only person who made her life bearable. Elijah is the most intelligent and capable person at Blackwater. He's managing operations better than Cornelius ever did. And he's been the only person who truly supported me during the worst period of my life. I will not sell him away to satisfy gossip and speculation from people who don't understand our situation. The pastor's intervention attempted to frame the issue in moral rather than social terms, warning Margaret that her soul was in danger if she continued in a relationship that violated both divine law and human statute. Mrs. Blackwood, I must speak plainly. The nature of your relationship with this slave has progressed beyond anything that can be defended as proper interaction between mistress and servant. You are violating God's law about racial separation, you are violating Georgia law prohibiting interracial relations, and you are setting an example that threatens the entire social order that keeps our society stable and civilized. If you continue on this path, I will have no choice but to recommend that the church leadership excommunicate you and that civil authorities investigate whether criminal charges should be filed. The ultimatum that Margaret faced, choose between Elijah and everything else including family, community, church and legal safety, represented the moment when Elijah's plan could have collapsed if his psychological control over her proved insufficient. But Elijah had spent 3 years preparing Margaret for exactly this confrontation, had anticipated every argument her family and community would deploy, and had provided counter-narratives that framed her choice as between authentic happiness with someone who truly loved her versus submission to a hypocritical society that had never valued her for anything except her ornamental function as Cornelius's wife. Margaret's final response to the delegation demonstrated that Elijah had won this critical battle for her allegiance. I appreciate your concern, but my relationship with Elijah is none of your business. He is my property, and I will manage him as I see fit. If that means I lose your approval and your company, then that is a price I am willing to pay. Now please leave my home. The social ostracism that followed Margaret's refusal to dismiss Elijah or to restore proper racial boundaries was immediate and comprehensive. As neighboring plantations stopped inviting her to social events, church members avoided her, and even merchants in Millbrook began treating her with barely concealed contempt for violating the racial taboos that defined Southern society. But the ostracism had the paradoxical effect of driving Margaret deeper into dependence on Elijah, as he became literally the only person in her life who provided companionship, conversation, and emotional support, now that she had been cut off from every other social connection. The legal maneuvering that Elijah orchestrated during the winter of 1859-1860 to begin transferring actual ownership of Blackwater from Margaret to himself involved exploiting George's laws in ways that demonstrated his comprehensive understanding of how legal systems could be manipulated by people who understood their vulnerabilities and who had access to lawyers willing to bend rules for sufficient compensation. The first step involved convincing Margaret to officially free Elijah from slavery, a procedure that required demonstrating that he had performed extraordinary service, meriting manumission, and required posting bond to ensure the freed person wouldn't become a public burden. The Freedom Papers that were filed in January 1860 described Elijah's loyal service and his crucial role in maintaining Blackwater after Cornelius's death, presenting his manumission as reward for devotion rather than as part of a conspiracy to transfer property to someone who couldn't legally own it while enslaved. The bond was posted using Blackwater's funds, essentially meaning that the plantation paid for Elijah's freedom, and within weeks he possessed legal documents establishing him as a free man of color with the right to own property, enter contracts, and manage his own affairs, subject only to the restrictions that Georgia law imposed on free black people, but which were far less severe than the absolute legal nullity of enslaved status. But freedom alone wasn't sufficient for Elijah to control Blackwater. He needed Margaret to transfer legal ownership to him in ways that Georgia law would recognize, despite prohibitions on interracial marriage that would have been the most straightforward method of property transfer. The solution involved creating complex legal structures where Margaret would nominally retain ownership, while Elijah would exercise control through powers of attorney, management contracts, and eventually through purchases of specific properties that could be legally transferred to a free black man even if the entire plantation couldn't be. The most audacious aspect of Elijah's legal strategy involved using Margaret's money to purchase portions of Blackwater from her, essentially making her pay him to take her own property, while maintaining the fiction that these were legitimate business transactions rather than disguised gifts that would have been legally vulnerable to challenge by Cornelius's relatives who had been excluded from inheriting. Over the course of 1860 and early 1861, Elijah purchased Blackwater's timber stands, its riverfront properties, several commercial buildings in Millbrook, and portions of the plantation's best agricultural land, using purchase prices that were technically fair market value, but which were funded through loans that Margaret provided and which Elijah would never need to repay, because the lender and borrower were effectively operating as a single economic unit. The reaction of Georgia society to the news that an enslaved man had been freed and was now purchasing property from his former mistress ranged from shock to outrage to grudging fascination at the audacity of what Elijah was accomplishing. Several of Cornelius's relatives attempted to challenge the transactions in court, arguing that Elijah must have exercised undue influence over Margaret or that the sales were fraudulent transfers designed to deprive legitimate heirs of their inheritance. But the legal protections that Elijah had built into each transaction, fair market prices, independent appraisals, proper documentation, made the sales difficult to challenge successfully. And Margaret's consistent testimony that she was acting of her own free will made it impossible to prove the coercion that everyone suspected but no one could demonstrate. The transformation of Elijah from freed slave to property owner occurred incrementally over 1860 and early 1861 as he accumulated more and more of what had been Blackwater Plantation, while Margaret retained nominal ownership of the residential property and the remaining agricultural land. But the practical reality was that Elijah controlled operations, made all management decisions, collected all revenue, and lived openly in the plantation house with Margaret in a relationship that everyone understood, violated Georgia's laws against interracial cohabitation, but which no one could definitively prove was sexual in nature rather than simply a business partnership between former mistress and freed servant. The Civil War's outbreak in April 1861 created chaos that Elijah exploited brilliantly to complete his acquisition of Blackwater. As Confederate Georgia's attention focused on military matters rather than on property transfers, and as many of the men who might have challenged his accumulation of property were called to military service or fled to avoid conscription. During the war years, Elijah used the disruption to purchase the remainder of Blackwater's properties at depressed prices, reflecting the collapse of cotton markets and the uncertainty about property values in a society where slavery was being destroyed by Union military advances. The final legal transfer that gave Elijah complete ownership of everything that had belonged to Cornelius Blackwood occurred in 1863 when Margaret, facing financial pressures created by Confederate currency's collapse and by the impossibility of continuing plantation operations without enslaved labor that was escaping to Union lines, sold the residential property and remaining agricultural land to Elijah for prices that were nominally fair given market conditions, but which everyone understood represented the culmination of a 4-year process of transferring property from white widow to her former slave who had murdered her husband to make this transfer possible. The marriage between Elijah and Margaret that occurred secretly in late 1863, performed by a minister who had been paid enough to ignore Georgia's laws prohibiting interracial unions, represented the final step in Elijah's transformation from enslaved property to plantation owner, married to the white woman whose husband he had killed and whose property he had systematically stolen through a combination of murder, seduction, and legal manipulation that demonstrated intelligence and ruthlessness that Georgia society had claimed black people could never possess. The aftermath of the Civil War found Elijah in the extraordinary position of being one of the wealthiest landowners in central Georgia, having transformed himself from enslaved field hand to owner of 8,000 acres and numerous commercial properties through a combination of murder, manipulation, and ruthless exploitation of the chaos that emancipation and Confederate defeat had created throughout the South. The marriage to Margaret that had been secret during the war became semi-public during Reconstruction when federal occupation made Georgia's anti-miscegenation laws temporarily unenforceable, though the couple still faced enormous social hostility from white Georgians who viewed their relationship as violation of every racial taboo that had sustained antebellum society. But Elijah's wealth and the protection provided by Union military authorities made him effectively untouchable during the Reconstruction period, allowing him to operate openly as one of central Georgia's major landowners, despite the rage and resentment his very existence created among white supremacists who saw him as living proof that their entire worldview about racial hierarchies had been based on lies. The immediate post-war period saw Elijah consolidating his control over what had been Blackwater Plantation, now renamed Freeman's Landing, in a gesture that simultaneously celebrated his freedom and erased the Blackwood family's name from property they had owned for 3 generations. The formerly enslaved population at the plantation faced a complex situation where their former peer had become their employer, a transformation that created both opportunities and tensions as Elijah offered wage labor contracts that were far more generous than most former slaves could obtain elsewhere, but which also required acknowledging that someone who had picked cotton alongside them now owned the land and controlled their economic opportunities. The relationship between Elijah and the black community in central Georgia was marked by both admiration and unease, as formerly enslaved people recognized that his success demonstrated capabilities that white supremacy claimed black people didn't possess, while also understanding that his methods, murder, theft, and exploitation of a white woman's vulnerability, were not replicable strategies for general uplift. Elijah became something of a legend in black oral traditions as the man who had successfully inverted every assumption about racial hierarchies, but he was also viewed with suspicion by many who questioned whether success built on murder and manipulation truly represented progress or simply individual advancement achieved through methods that couldn't provide models for collective liberation. The political impact of Elijah's existence during Reconstruction extended beyond his individual case to influence debates about black capability and the possibilities for interracial society in the post-war South. Radical Republicans cited him as proof that formerly enslaved people possessed intelligence and business acumen equal to any white person when given opportunity and education, while white supremacists pointed to the same evidence to argue that the only way a black man could achieve such success was through criminal behavior and sexual exploitation of white women, rather than through legitimate competition. Both interpretations missed the complexity of Elijah's actual story, but both used him as symbol in political struggles about what Reconstruction would mean for racial hierarchies and economic power. The violence that Reconstruction-era Georgia's white supremacists attempted to deploy against Elijah as punishment for his violations of racial boundaries proved ineffective because of his wealth, his political connections with Republican authorities, and his willingness to defend himself and his property with deadly force when necessary. Several attempts by Ku Klux Klan members to intimidate or attack Elijah during the late 1860s ended with dead or wounded white men after Elijah demonstrated that he possessed both weapons and the will to use them against anyone who threatened him. The failures of these attacks only enhanced Elijah's legendary status among black Georgians, while deepening white resentment of a man who seemed to embody every nightmare that slavery's defenders had predicted would follow emancipation. Margaret's position during the Reconstruction years represented its own form of tragedy, as she found herself completely ostracized from white society while never being fully accepted by black communities who understood that her relationship with Elijah had begun while he was enslaved, and while she held power over him that made genuine consent questionable regardless of how their relationship later evolved. She lived as Elijah's wife in increasing isolation, dependent on laudanum to cope with the psychological burden of choices that had seemed liberating when she made them, but which had resulted in a life where she had no community, no family connections, and no identity except as the white woman who had married her former slave after he murdered her first husband. The true nature of Cornelius Blackwood's death remained officially unsettled, despite rumors that circulated throughout Reconstruction Georgia. No one had ever proven that the hunting accident was actually murder, but everyone understood that Elijah had killed his master and had gotten away with it through perfect execution and the chaos that had prevented thorough investigation. The inability to prove or punish this murder represented profound humiliation for white supremacists who needed to believe that black people couldn't successfully plan and execute sophisticated crimes against their white oppressors, and Elijah's continued prosperity despite widespread suspicion of murder only deepened the sense that traditional racial hierarchies had been permanently disrupted. The economic success that Elijah achieved during Reconstruction, through aggressive acquisition of additional properties from white landowners facing economic collapse, demonstrated business acumen that would have been remarkable regardless of his racial background or the murder that had initiated his rise. He purchased foreclosed plantations at auction, bought commercial properties in Millbrook and surrounding towns at depressed prices, and invested in railroad development and other infrastructure projects that Reconstruction was bringing to Georgia. By 1870, Elijah's wealth was estimated at over $200,000, equivalent to millions in modern currency, making him one of the richest black men in the entire South, and proof that the intelligence and capability that slavery had tried to suppress could produce extraordinary success when freed from bondage. But the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the return of white democratic control to Georgia created existential threats to Elijah's position, as the state's new government immediately began implementing laws designed to restore white supremacy and to strip black Georgians of rights and property they had acquired during federal occupation. The anti-miscegenation laws that federal authorities had prevented Georgia from enforcing during Reconstruction were reinstated and vigorously prosecuted, creating legal jeopardy for Elijah and Margaret's marriage and potentially exposing them to criminal charges that could result in imprisonment and property seizure. The decision that Elijah faced in 1877, whether to remain in Georgia and fight for his property against a government determined to destroy him, or to flee to the north where his wealth and his marriage would be safer from legal attack, represented the ultimate test of the ambition and ruthlessness that had driven his entire rise from slavery. The choice was complicated by Margaret's declining health and her psychological fragility, after years of isolation and laudanum dependence, and by the reality that leaving Georgia would mean abandoning property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars that couldn't be quickly liquidated without accepting massive losses. The compromise that Elijah negotiated involved selling Freeman's Landing and his other Georgia properties to white buyers at substantial discounts in exchange for being allowed to leave the state unmolested rather than facing prosecution for miscegenation or renewed investigation into Cornelius Blackwood's death. The sales occurred during 1877-1878 and netted Elijah approximately $120,000 after he had been forced to accept prices far below his property's actual value, representing a massive wealth transfer back to white Georgians, but still leaving him with more money than most Americans of any race would possess. The relocation to Philadelphia in 1878 marked Elijah's transformation from Georgia's most notorious success story into a relatively anonymous, wealthy black businessman in a northern city where interracial marriage was legal and where his past was unknown to most people he encountered. He and Margaret lived quietly in a comfortable townhouse, with Elijah investing his remaining wealth in real estate and businesses that generated income without requiring his active management. Margaret died in 1882 from laudanum overdose that may have been accidental or suicidal, leaving Elijah a widower at age 53, with wealth, freedom, and the knowledge that he had accomplished the impossible at costs that had destroyed everyone around him, including the woman whose husband he had murdered and whose property he had stolen. The final decades of Elijah's life, through his death in 1903, saw him living as a Philadelphia gentleman whose Georgia past was known only through rumors and whose wealth allowed him to exist in social circles that would have been impossible for most black Americans, regardless of their financial resources. He never remarried, never returned to Georgia, and never publicly discussed the murder, seduction, and theft that had transformed him from enslaved property to property owner. The only acknowledgement of his extraordinary past came in a deathbed confession to a black minister who recorded Elijah's statement that he had killed Cornelius Blackwood deliberately, that he had seduced and manipulated Margaret systematically, and that he regretted nothing except the suffering his actions had caused to enslaved people at Blackwater, who had faced increased surveillance and harsher treatment after white authorities realized that one of their own had achieved the impossible. The legacy of Elijah's story extended far beyond his individual case to influence how both black and white Americans understood the possibilities and limitations of individual advancement in a society structured by racial oppression. For black communities, Elijah represented both inspiration and cautionary tale, proof that extraordinary intelligence could overcome even slavery, but also demonstration that individual success through criminal methods couldn't substitute for collective liberation through legal and political means. For white supremacists, Elijah represented their worst nightmare made real, an enslaved man who had proven smarter, more capable, and more ruthless than his white owners, who had murdered and stolen his way to the top of society, and who had lived prosperously until natural death, despite violating every racial taboo that Southern culture had constructed. Modern historians studying Elijah's case have struggled with how to evaluate his actions ethically, as his story resists simple moral categorization. He was simultaneously a murderer who killed an unarmed man for personal gain, a brilliant strategist who exploited every opportunity to liberate himself from bondage, a manipulator who systematically deceived a vulnerable woman for years, and a symbol of black capability and ambition that challenged fundamental assumptions of white supremacist ideology. The complexity of his story reflects broader truths about how slavery created moral impossibilities, where survival and advancement often required actions that would be unconscionable in societies built on genuine freedom and equality. Dr. Marcus Washington, a contemporary professor of African American history at the University of Pennsylvania, has written extensively about Elijah's case and its significance for understanding the psychological and moral complexity of enslaved resistance. Elijah's story forces us to grapple with uncomfortable questions about what we're willing to celebrate as resistance and what crosses lines into criminal behavior that can't be justified, regardless of the oppression that motivated it. Dr. Washington argues in his book, From Property to Power: Extraordinary Cases of Enslaved People's Self-Liberation. He killed a man, manipulated a woman, and stole property through a combination of murder and fraud. But he also demonstrated intelligence and strategic thinking that white supremacy claimed black people couldn't possess, and he achieved freedom and prosperity through the only means available to someone held in absolute bondage. His story isn't inspirational in any simple sense, but it is important as a reminder that slavery created moral impossibilities, where the only paths to liberation sometimes required actions we would never justify in other contexts. The site of what had been Blackwater Plantation, later Freeman's Landing, eventually became the town of Elijah, Georgia, a name that the black majority population insisted on during Reconstruction despite white protests, though the town's name was changed back to Millbrook during the Jim Crow period when white supremacists reclaimed political control. The property itself was subdivided and sold to multiple owners over the decades following Elijah's departure, but local black communities maintained oral traditions about the man who had been enslaved there and who had murdered his master, married the widow, and briefly owned everything before being driven out by white rage at his violations of racial hierarchy. The extraordinary story of Elijah's transformation from enslaved field hand to wealthy landowner challenges every simple narrative about resistance, morality, and the possibilities for individual advancement within systems of absolute oppression. If this tale of murder, manipulation, and ruthless ambition has made you think differently about what enslaved people were capable of, about the moral complexity of resistance in impossible circumstances, and about whether individual success through criminal means represents victory or simply different forms of destruction, let me know in the comments below. Share this video with others who appreciate complex stories that refuse to offer heroes or simple lessons, but instead force us to confront the terrible choices that slavery created for everyone it touched. Subscribe for more incredible true stories exploring the hidden dimensions of enslaved resistance, including cases that demonstrate intelligence, strategic thinking, and moral complexity that simple narratives about accommodation or rebellion can never capture. These are the stories that remind us that some people achieve the impossible through methods we can barely comprehend, that slavery's absolute oppression sometimes produced responses of absolute ruthlessness, and that the line between liberation and crime becomes impossible to draw when the entire legal system is built on the crime of treating humans as property. Until next time, remember that history's most extraordinary individuals are often its most morally complex, that systems of absolute oppression create moral impossibilities with no good choices, and that understanding the past requires acknowledging nuance and complexity rather than searching for simple heroes and villains.